This week we have a story from the Civil War, one that starts with the Battle of Dug Hill, where Colonel William B. Stokes and his Union cavalry were lured into a brutal ambush by Confederates, and ends with another, more infamous encounter between Stokes' men and a family that had taken in some Confederate soldiers who needed a place to stay for the night. It's another one of the stories of Appalachia.
You know, I don't think I've heard this story before. There was a lot of things going on during the Civil War of families against families or somebody attacking another family and all, but I don't think I remember this from, well, especially from my history days in high school and also in college. I don't think I remember this story that well.
Well, this is more a bit of Tennessee history. And
Okay.
If you were raised in Virginia, like you and I both were, you probably didn't hear this because it didn't really resonate over there, I guess you'd say.
That explains a lot then.
But this story was provided to us by one of our listeners,
Great.
a fellow by the name of Dale Welch, who is a Putnam County, Tennessee historian, lives down in Monterey, and as I said, a listener to the podcast. Now, Rod, you have a little bit in common with him because he was a newspaper man for many years.
Okay.
And even owned his own newspaper down in Monterey called the Hilltop Express.
Oh, okay. I have heard of that paper before.
Yeah, very fascinating fella, giving us a lot of stories that we're working our way through. And Dale, we sure really do appreciate that.
Yes, we do.
Well, folks, we've told stories before about the lawlessness that swept through East Tennessee and eastern Kentucky during the Civil War. You know, bushwhackers, raiders, and desperate soldiers from both sides making life a living hell for the folks who called this place home. And while smaller skirmishes and raids were common, this fight at Dug Hill was the only major battle in Putnam County. But it was more than just another fight. Rod, it turned out to be a massacre.
All right, let's set the stage. The Battle of Dug Hill occurred on February 22nd, 1864, in, as Steve mentioned, Putnam County, Tennessee. The Union forces in the area were under the command of a Colonel William B. Stokes, who was the leader of the 5th Tennessee Cavalry. Now, Stokes was no ordinary officer. He was aggressive, he was unyielding, and, he was just downright ruthless when it came to rooting out Confederate guerrillas. Well, Stokes made it clear he was taking off the gloves. No time for being gentle with these people. He declared that he was raising the black flag, which meant no prisoners would be taken. Every bushwhacker they caught was to be, killed on sight. And you know who was just fine with that? The rebels. They were ready to return the favor. The Confederates in the area included some hardened fighters, Colonel John M. Hughes, Captain George Carter, Captain W. Scott Bledsoe, along with, that famous name that we've heard before, Champ Ferguson and his independent scouts.
And along with a group of Texas Rangers, they numbered about 40 men. Now, when they heard about Stokes' no-quarter policy, they decided they'd show the Yankees the same mercy. None at all. And they didn't have to wait long. Stokes had ordered a Union force under Captain E.W. Bass to leave Sparta, right up toward Cookeville, and loop back through Dry Valley. The rebels got word of the plan and set their own trap. They chose Dug Hill as their ambush point, a narrow stretch of road with large boulders and thick cedar and laurel trees, perfect for a surprise attack.
Well, that afternoon, as the Union soldiers rode through Dry Valley, a shot rang out. The Yankees spotted 2 rebel riders making a break for it, and they gave chase. That was a big mistake, because the fleeing riders were bait, and the Union soldiers, they took it. As soon as they were drawn in, the hidden rebels opened fire from behind the rocks and trees. Now, the Union soldiers, folks, be honest about it, they didn't stand a chance. Riders tumbled from their saddles. The ones who could still move scattered in panic. The Confederates chased them, gunning them down and hacking them. That's right, hacking them apart with whatever they had.
And one of the most feared men on that battlefield was an 18-year-old Confederate scout named John P. Gatewood. And Rod, if that name sounds familiar, it's because we've told Gatewood's story in a podcast episode last year. He was known as the red-haired, red-bearded beast of Georgia. Now, Gatewood was 6 feet tall with long, curly red hair and a wild red beard, a sight that, well, it must have been terrifying on its own. During the fight, with a pistol in each hand, he chased 5 Union soldiers up the hill. Those soldiers, thinking Gatewood had backup, surrendered, but when they realized he was alone, 2 of them tried to make a run for it. And Gatewood didn't hesitate. He gunned those soldiers down right there on the spot.
And just as he was about to finish this rest, George Carter, Captain George Carter, came charging up, shouting, "Hold on, John! Don't waste your ammunition. We have to fight for what we get." Instead of shooting, Carter grabbed stones and bashed in the remaining prisoners' heads. No quarter wasn't just a threat. It was, as I've heard before, it was a promise. Well, when Colonel Stokes' men returned the next day to recover their dead, they found all 41 bodies. All but 3 had been shot in the head. The others had their skulls crushed and caved in with rocks.
Well, the bodies were taken back to Sparta, laid out in an old store, and then buried. But not all of Stokes' soldiers made it back. Some fled through the woods, ditching their uniforms and grabbing women's dresses off clotheslines to disguise themselves. One soldier, Russell Gann, survived by hiding in a hollow log all night. Others weren't so lucky. The following winter, locals found skeletons laying scattered in the woods. And while the Battle of Dug Hill was the bloodiest fight in Putnam County, it didn't end there. Not long after, Union Colonel Blackburn challenged Confederate Colonel Hughes to a fight near Yankeetown. The rebels showed up with 50 men, while Blackburn had 75. The battle turned into a brutal hand-to-hand brawl before Blackburn finally sounded the retreat.
Now, Steve, let's kind of go back a little bit. Tennessee was a Union stronghold.
Well, part of Tennessee.
Part of
East
Tennessee.
East Tennessee.
Right.
Yeah.
East Tennessee was. So these Confederates were, I guess, from the ones that just weren't happy with what they were doing. Some of the Union soldiers or whatever were doing in East Tennessee, or they came in like the Texas Rangers, and all of this ended up just, well, it became a notorious incident that would haunt Colonel William Stokes for the rest of his life.
Yeah, Rod Stokes began a ruthless search for Confederate soldiers, and that led to a ruthless act of vengeance that claimed the lives of 6 unarmed Confederate soldiers and very nearly destroyed an entire family. And at the heart of this story is a man named Uncle Abe Officer, whose bravery and quick thinking saved lives, and whose loyalty, well, it reveals a complicated family secret. On March 12, 1864, just a couple of weeks after the slaughter at Dug Hill, Stokes and roughly 200 Federal troops were scouring the countryside for Confederate holdouts. Their search brought them to Sinking Cane, a small, isolated community on the edge of Overton and Putnam counties, about 4 miles northwest of present-day Monterey.
Well, at the break of dawn that day, Colonel Stokes and his men came up on the house of William Alexander Officer and his wife, Cynthia. The officers were hosting a small group of Confederate soldiers who had become separated from their units after the skirmishes in the area. These soldiers had been in the middle of a rare moment of peace, setting down for breakfast. It was a special treat that morning because the officer's son, John Holford Officer, was home on leave, and he wasn't the only guest. With him were 6 other Confederate soldiers: Second Lieutenant Robert S. Davis of the 8th Texas Cavalry, John P. York, also of the 8th Texas Cavalry, William M. Slaughter of the 1st Texas Rangers, Samuel Garrett, William Oliver Shipp of the 8th Texas Infantry, and William A. Lipscomb of the 3rd Alabama Cavalry.
And Rod, there was one more guest, a young boy named Johnny King from Manchester, Tennessee. It's not certain, but the King boy was likely tagging along to help with the horses and run errands for the soldiers. Well, the officers knew they were taking a risk by sheltering these men. In fact, Mr. Officer had warned his visitors that it was too dangerous to stay there, but the soldiers insisted. You see, they were tired, hungry, and probably thought they were safe, but unfortunately, they most certainly were not. With lightning speed, Stokes' Union forces surrounded the house before the Confederates even realized what was happening. There was only a moment's warning, just enough for John Officer to jump up from the breakfast table.
Okay, now this is where Uncle Abe comes in. He was a trusted family slave, listed as a mulatto in the census, and family lore held that his father was none other than William Alexander Officer, making Abe the half-brother of John H. Officer. Now, when the Yankees swarmed the house, Uncle Abe didn't hesitate. He grabbed John and rushed to the loft above the kitchen where they had prearranged a hiding spot. Thanks to Abe, John Officer escaped the massacre that followed. But the other soldiers weren't so lucky. They had stacked their weapons in a parlor, making them, you guessed it, unreachable when the Union troops came in, bursting in. The men were unarmed, completely vulnerable, and they were slaughtered where they stood.
Second Lieutenant Robert Davis, who was still nursing a gunshot wound to the foot from Doug Hill, was dragged into the yard. As he stood against a fence post, he threw up his hands and shouted, "I surrender!" But it didn't matter. Stokes' men were out for blood. Even though Davis pleaded for his life, telling Union soldiers holding him, "Boys, you ought not to do this. I've never done anything but my sworn duty," they executed him right there on the spot. And according to Uncle Abe's later testimony to the Tennessee Historical Society, Davis never flinched as they riddled his body with bullets, just like a firing squad.
Wow. Well, meanwhile, inside the house, young Johnny King was discovered hiding behind a chair in the parlor. Now, the soldiers were going to kill him, but Uncle Abe stepped in again, telling them that the boy was just an orphan wandering from house to house. His quick thinking saved Johnny's life. One of the other Confederates, Private William Slaughter, had tried to hide upstairs. He slipped between the straw and the bedding of a bed, hoping the Yankees wouldn't spot him. But his long hair betrayed him. It was hanging out from under the bedding, and when the soldiers spotted it, Slaughter jumped up and tried to run, because they knew it wasn't a possum or anything like that. They knew it was a human being. They gunned him down before he could make it to the stairs.
And in the chaos, Mrs. Officer was accidentally shot in the back. She had been caught in the crossfire when Private Ship tried to flee, grabbing her hand as he was cut down. The bullet struck her in the shoulder. She survived, but it was a horribly painful wound. Well, after the massacre of those rebel soldiers, Stokes' men weren't done. They were still hunting for John Officer. They dragged Uncle Abe outside, tied a rope around his neck, and threatened to hang him if he didn't give up John's hiding place. But Abe, well, he was as tough as he was loyal. He refused to betray his half-brother, saying, "Don't you believe that to save my life I'd tell you where they were?"
Well, Steve, they must have believed him, because they let him go. But they still weren't finished with the family. So here they go. They tried to set the house on fire 3 times. Each time, Mr. Officer kicked the fire out with his boots. Finally, one of Stokes' men, Zeke Bass, told Mr. Officer that his wife, being shot, had been a blessing in disguise. Well, why is that, you may ask? Well, because they were planning to kill him and burn the house, but out of pity for his wounded wife, they decided to spare him and the home. After the Yankees left, John H. Officer finally emerged from the hiding place in the loft. He slipped away into the woods and made his way to a neighboring house where he grabbed an old hat to conceal his identity.
And Rod, then he ran. He climbed a high hill and crossed a road right in front of the Yankees. They spotted him and ordered him to halt. But he didn't pay attention to that. And surprisingly, they didn't fire. They assumed he was just a local man and didn't want to draw attention by shooting. John Officer escaped for good. Meanwhile, Uncle Abe gathered the bodies of the fallen Confederates and buried them in a common grave in the Conley Cemetery now known as Officer Cemetery, just down the road from the family home.
The massacre devastated the Officer family, as you can imagine, but somehow Mrs. Officer survived her wounds, and their daughter, Henrietta Capps, rode 17 miles on horseback while, yes, heavily pregnant. They made them tough back in those days, to be by her mother's side. And just 3 days after that ride, well, all that bouncing around must have done something, because Henrietta gave birth to a son.
Well, Rod, the Alexander Officer home still stands today, a silent witness to one of the most harrowing stories from the Civil War. And I guess this is on a par with some of the other stories about Civil War we told, particularly the stuff about John Gatewood.
Yep.
But this was just rough. This was flat out massacre of those soldiers.
Dale, thank you for sending us this story, because I learned something out of this. I learned that there were more than just one or two massacres that took place. Of course, we're talking about in Tennessee, there were a lot of other things that took place, but this is one of those examples. But I'm telling you, I guess they just had a reason for wanting to go. They wanted to kill everybody out of that division and stuff that had come in there. And it wasn't anything peaceful. It was something that they just wanted to put an end to it, and their best choice was to kill all those soldiers.
Well, this is what happens when you have a civil war.
Yes.
And it gets to a certain point where, if you're too well matched, incidents like this happen, partly out of frustration, partly out of a desire to just completely overwhelm the other side, and partly out of just pure meanness. But yeah, it was a terrible, horrible thing that happened there.
Yeah.
And folks, that's the story of the Battle of Dug Hill and the subsequent Officer House Massacre, another one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for watching. Now, if you like our stories, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app or over on our YouTube channel. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.